My name is Alexander Hagan. I am the CEO of a small, medium-sized tech company in Silicon Valley. Tonight's presentation on the death of Muammar Gaddafi is based on the writing of Sharif Ba, who is the international editor of Newstime Africa and a respected journalist. And his article is called "Reversing the Gains of a Nation." The demise of Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, who was summarily executed by Libya's National Transitional Council rebel fighters after being wounded in a NATO airstrike on his convoy just outside his hometown of Sirte, may have indeed marked the end of an era in the history of that country. But events surrounding his execution have also left a legacy of hatred. The Libyan sandy dust is now settling down after NATO bombs have stopped falling. The NTC is coming to terms with the daunting task at hand and have asked NATO to stick around. But NATO forces are missionaries who should be returning to base once the mission is accomplished. And in the case of Libya, the, quote, humanitarian intervention, unquote, mandate of, quote, protecting civilians, unquote, his quotes, not mine, has already been accomplished through regime change. NATO member countries, along with Qatar, trained, armed, and provided intelligence and air support for rebel activities which culminated into the ouster of the Gaddafi regime. This adds credence to claims that the rebellion, which had been nurtured, armed, and orchestrated largely from abroad in collaboration with expatriate opposition groups and their local allies at home, had nothing to do with, quote, humanitarian concerns, unquote. The slain leader had long been placed on Western powers' death row, and plans of regime change were drawn long before the Benghazi insurgency, which provided perfect cover with all the hallmarks of a well-orchestrated civil war. But with the entire country now under their control, the inability of the Council to take command of national security is testing the leadership's resolve in meeting the challenges. City-states. Libya is a country built on tribal ties, and the decision of the Council to delay the formation of a new government after the country has been without a functioning central government since Gaddafi was ousted more than 9 weeks ago has left a power vacuum now filled by tribal leaders. Thanks to the proliferation of weapons, the country has been carved up into loose city-states. Misrata, for example, and Zintan in the Western Mountains have their own militias and regional governments, acting almost independently. There is little cohesion or coordination among the various groups, and no one to rein in their excesses. The NTC, which declared itself to be the only legitimate body representing the people of Libya and the Libyan state, is weak and divided over what its interim leader, Mustafa Abdul Jalil, describes as, quote, differences in views among NTC members, unquote. Radicalization. Under the late Gaddafi's brand of communal socialism, Islamic worship was state-regulated, and any apparent manifestation of political or militant Islam drew harsh security crackdowns. In fact, the now defunct Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, a militant jihadist organization, knew too well. Co-founded by Abdel Hakim Belhaj, a man who had fought the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 80s alongside Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, the LIFG waged a bloody insurgency against the late colonel in the 90s until it was defeated by the regime in 1998. On the run until 2004, when he was captured in a CIA operation in Malaysia, Belhaj was handed over to Colonel Gaddafi's regime after being interrogated in Thailand and Hong Kong. He was later freed on a de-radicalization program for imprisoned Libyan militants. Belhaj was among the first to take up the fight against the colonel's regime during the outbreak of the Libya uprising. Trained and armed by Qatari special forces in the Western Mountains, his troops marched triumphantly into Tripoli. With his troops now numbering around 8,000, the man known in the jihad world as Abu Abdullah al-Sadiq is the city's most visible military commander as head of Tripoli's Supreme Council. The NTC and their Western supporters are now raising concerns to the Qataris, whose aid seem to be empowering primarily Islamist leaders at the possible expense of the embryonic rebel government. In trying to present the rebels as, quote, liberators, unquote, the West had ignored the central role of al-Qaeda-affiliated terrorists within rebel ranks until now. But Belhaj and other Islamist militia leaders say they seek only their fair share of power. Was the NTC's announcement that Libya's new constitutional laws would be based on Islamic Sharia principles an attempt to appease the Islamist militia groups who've become a force to reckon with in a post-Gaddafi Libya? Now, if I may make a personal aside, this is Alexander Hagan speaking. I've had a discussion about Sharia with a number of people, and it seems to me that Sharia law is a double-edged sword, and that people who are ill-equipped to implement it is a very dangerous weapon. in the hands of proper society in a stable state, it can be implemented in a non-threatening way to women's rights. At least that's the discussion that I've had. So Sharia law itself is not the, so to speak, enemy. The problem is Sharia law in the hands of someone who could potentially abuse it, or a reactionary or an Islamic radical. Because in Islam, there's what you can do and what you should do. And what you can do isn't always what you should do, just as in our own Western Christian religion, there's a saying by Shakespeare, even the devil hath means to quote scripture. Back to the article. Reversing the gains. In an attempt to replace a dictatorial regime with a, quote, pro-democracy rebel government, unquote, the NATO invasion into Libya has destroyed that country's economic and social achievements over the last 40 years. Achievements that most countries under Western-style, quote, multi-party democracy, unquote, and, quote, good governance, unquote, can only dream of. Public health care in Libya, for instance, was free, the best in Africa. According to FAO's country profile in Libya, the country has had a high standard of living and a robust per capita daily caloric intake of 3144. Since 1980, child mortality rates have dropped from 70 per thousand live births to 19 in 2009. Life expectancy has risen from 61 to 74 years of age during the same span of years. On education, World Bank's country brief on Libya reports that, quote, in a relatively short period of time, Libya achieved universal access for primary education with 98% gross enrollment in secondary and 46% for tertiary education. In the past decade, girls' enrollment increased by 12% in all levels of education. In secondary and tertiary education, girls outnumbered boys by 10%. Prior to NATO's humanitarian intervention, Libya was at the implementation stage of an ambitious multi-billion-dollar infrastructure development plan focused on the renovating and construction of airports, roads, housing, schools, hospitals, and water and sanitation projects nationwide, as well as the railway project, an ambitious 4,800-kilometer Trans-Africa rail network planned to link Tunisia and Egypt, and a southern network linking Sabah to Chad and Niger. The railway project was a talking point as a major infrastructural project of interest in the mold of the Great Man-Made River Project, a similar mammoth undertaking by the ousted regime. In most developing countries, essential food prices have skyrocketed. Libya was one of the few countries in the developing world which maintained a system of price control over essential food staples, while rising food prices in neighboring Tunisia and Egypt spearheaded social unrest and political dissent. The system of food subsidies in Libya was fully maintained. Crossroads. As Western powers haggle with their Qatari counterparts over what type of government is best suited for the country, Libyans, on the other hand, are busy at tribal levels consulting on the formation of a power-sharing government, oblivious of what goes on among their, quote, liberators, unquote. To the West, it would be naive to assume that Libya would be able to peacefully evolve into a Western-style democracy after more than 40 years of socialist rule with no democratic foundations in place. And the Qataris need not be reminded that a government made up of Islamist leaders would not appease the West, no matter how democratic such a government turns out to be. But to the general masses, it is about the provision of free universal health care, education, and even more basic necessities such as food. After all, what is the essence of democracy if such basic necessities of life cannot be accessed by all? A lesson for Africa. If there is a lesson to be learned in Africa on the Libya uprising, it has to be Western powers' disregard for African states, institutions, and opinions in dealing with the crisis of an African member state. One cannot help but ask, whose voice really counts when it comes to decision-making on African matters at the so-called United Nations organization? Perhaps this is why Jean-Paul Pugala's analysis, in which he calls on all 50 African nations to simply quit the United Nations because this organization, by its very structure and hierarchy, is at the service of the most powerful, has been well received across the continent. But Pugala's argument is not entirely new because the facts on Africa's relationship with the West have always been known. What may be new, however, is the level of Western insult on Africa's integrity, as the entire continent stood accused of supporting the late leader in exchange for material gains, thereby undermining the AU, the African Union's credibility within the international community regarding the Libya crisis. Little wonder, then, why the voice of the AU was quick to fade into the background, while the rest of the international community passed judgment over an AU member state. According to Pugala, Africa's only way to make a point is to use the Chinese method, drawing parallels with Mao's China, which waited for 26 years for, quote, China's dignity to be respected. But can Pugala's Africa afford to bite the Western figure that feeds the starving continent? We do not need to be reminded of the number of African governments who depend on annual Western handouts, including those of UN specialized agencies, to run their countries, thanks to corrupt and inept politicians who continue to plunder and siphon their nation's wealth off to Western banks abroad. The Cameroonian writer could perhaps make his case stronger by first advocating a thorough house cleansing crusade to purge the continent of corrupt politicians and then utilize its vast resources for the common good of its people. Only then will Africans boast of real freedom and true independence. The way to restore eroded integrity, and that was how China's dignity became respected, not just by quitting the United Nations. My name is Alexander Hagen. Thank you, good night, and good luck.